So I had already decided to cloth diaper my baby, but I thought that this was especially useful right now. I know most of you guys have probably already been restocked in your areas for baby wipes, but in my area, we did have a shortage of baby wipes whenever the whole toilet paper crisis happened, and it was really awful. But I was really lucky that for us, we weren't really in a bind because we had already decided to cloth diaper. I know I'm not the only one that has frugality and just trying to be more self-sufficient on my mind, just because I know that a lot of you guys are out of work right now. A lot of you are worrying about how to pay for the basic necessities, but you guys maybe have some time, but not necessarily cash right now. And for those of you that do, maybe are thinking about in what ways can you prepare in case something like this happens again. So with all that uncertainty, it is nice to do something proactive to try and make things better if it does happen that way. So you do not have to be cloth diapering in order to use cloth wipes. Some people might want to start with this to dip their toes in and see if maybe it's something for them or if it's not. And some people may never ever want to do the cloth diapering thing. They like disposables too much, but this is just a way to save a little bit of money because one cloth wipe typically is all I need for an entire diaper change, whereas I was using some disposable wipes that we got from our baby shower originally, and sometimes I would use like 4 or 5 wipes to clean my baby's butt. That's ridiculous. So that being said, let's talk about what kind of fabrics we can use for this project. So here are some of the fabrics that I have right here. There's some brushed cottons and some flannels. All of these will work great. They are lighter weight and softer on the skin. You can also use terry cloth, and that's like what bath towels are made out of. I would try and look for the softest ones that you can. You can just buy regular baby washcloths. They're really soft and they work great if that's what you want to do, but they're generally more expensive, so I'm generally steering away from them. So here's something else that you can do. It's actually a French terry. This is some scrap that I had from my old job that I saved from the trash, by the way, eco-friendly. It's actually a knit fabric, and it's got the loops of like what a typical terry cloth would have on the backside. But it is knit. It's pretty stable. It's not super stretchy, but that is an option that you can use. It's a little bit softer than a regular terry cloth would be. So you do not have to actually go out and buy anything for this project. You can honestly just raid your closet and use old t-shirts, use old flannels, pretty much anything as long as it is soft on the baby's skin and absorbent. Those are the two things that you are looking for. Oh, and machine washable, obviously. Generally speaking, you can use just about anything. If it is a very thin fabric, you might just want to layer up and use a few more layers than you normally would on some of the other ones, just to make sure that your hand is not disgusting by the end of a diaper change. So you can test to see if your fabric is absorbent by just dropping a few beads of water on it. If the water beads up, then it's not going to be very absorbent, but if it soaks in just fine, then it is perfectly fine for this project.
Of course, you can make these whatever measurement you want. I'm making mine 8 inches by 8 inches. That way they'll match the set of cloth wipes that I already have in my collection. To make this project go as fast and easy as possible, I'm actually going to be tearing my fabric into strips because I'm making so many cloth wipes at one time. So to do this, I'm just lining my selvage up on the measurement side of my rotary mat, and I'm cutting every 8 inches, and then at that cut mark, I'm just tearing my fabric. Make sure you've already done this on the part of the fabric that lines up with the 0 measurement. That way you know that your line is perfectly straight before you start cutting at the 8 inches and the 16-inch marks. Once I'm done tearing my fabric into strips, I take it over to my ironing board and I press along each of the edges because with my fabric at least, it definitely curled them up, and I do that for all of the strips. Once all of my strips have been pressed, I stack them up in stacks of 3 or 4, and I make sure that all of the edges are actually lined up as closely as possible and as straight as possible. I line one long side up with a horizontal line on my rotary mat, and I line one short side up with that as well. And sometimes it'll be a little bit warped and kind of have like a rainbow effect instead of a perfectly straight line. If you give it just a little bit of tug on the short side, it'll help relax some of those fibers and make a straight line for you. Honestly, for this project, it probably doesn't matter that much that all of your pieces are perfectly on grain, but as you might know from my previous videos, I am a little bit anal about cutting and making sure everything is on grain, and so I had to do this. I had to. But once your fabric is on grain and stacked up evenly and looks good, you can line up your short edge with the 0 measurement, and then I line my clear plastic ruler up with the 8-inch mark on either side of the strip of fabric, and I use that as a guide for my rotary cutter. And I repeat this every 8 inches, and I adjust my fabric as I go if anything gets warped or moved around, just to make sure I have a perfectly square piece. And it turns out that making my cloth wipes 8 inches square was actually perfect for my fabric, because in the end I only ended up wasting about a 1/2 of an inch on one side of my fabric, and the rest of it was just the selvage, so it ended up working out really well. So I suggest before starting your project, you might actually measure to see how wide your goods are beforehand. That way you can decide exactly how big you want your wipes to be if you're looking to not waste any fabric. So I decided to round the corners of my cloth wipes. You don't have to do this depending on the type of finish that you're wanting to use. However, there are some finishes that it's going to be more beneficial for you to round your corners, and we'll talk about which ones those are in a little bit. So depending on the type of fabric that you've chosen, you can definitely stop here and leave the edges raw, and that's all that you have to do, and you have a cloth wipe. However, if your fabric does fray, then you're definitely going to want to use another finishing method. The other no-sew method that you can do is to use pinking shears. Now, the way pinking shears works is that it actually cuts a little zigzag into your fabric, and this helps prevent fraying. Now, if your fabric is a slightly looser weave or has a really easy time unraveling, then this method probably won't work for you, because even with the pinking shears, it can still unravel. I was certain that this method was going to work for me because this fabric didn't seem like it was going to have any issues. However, it did have issues. It was too loose of a weave, a little bit too thin, and it still unraveled in the wash, and I had a huge tangled mess that I had to deal with later on. And so yeah, you should definitely test a wipe before you go ahead and do all of the other ones. Just do whatever method you want and then wash it before continuing. You will save yourself so much time and headache. So the first stitch that I'm going to show you on a sewing machine is called an overcast stitch, a seam overcast stitch, or a blanket stitch. All of these will work, as well as a zigzag stitch if that's the only stitch that you have. Now, the overcast stitch typically requires you to use a special foot for it. You don't necessarily have to, but it definitely does help to wrap around the edge of your fabric, and you can use these with the 3-step zigzag stitch as well. But if your machine has an overcast stitch and requires a special foot for it, typically they do come with one. The seam and overcast stitch that I am showing you here is a great stitch to use if you are deciding to use more than one layer of fabric, because it does wrap around the edge, but it also sews a seam at the same time. So it's 2 steps in one, so it's going to save you a little bit of time. Moving on to our serger, you can also do a 4-thread overlock stitch. This is a great stitch to use if you are working with a knit, because this is what's used regularly on knits in store-bought garments, but just in store-bought garments in general, whether they're wovens or knits, we see this stitch being used a lot commercially. This is also a really good stitch to use if your fabric frays a lot, because it does cover part of the raw edge of the fabric, and so it's less likely to get damaged in the wash and that sort of thing, which will cause additional fraying, and so I really like this stitch for that purpose. So after my initial mistake with using pinking shears on the entire stack, I definitely decided to test out these last few wipes before committing to any one stitching method, because I did not want to make the same mistake twice. Now, I'm glad I did that because I realized that my fabric was still a little bit too loose of a weave to use any of these methods. As much as I liked the feeling of using one layer of fabric initially, and I liked the idea of having more wipes for the amount of fabric that I was using, it just did not work out because the fabric was actually so thin that it reminded me of disposable wipes, and I kept almost throwing them away. Also, with my fabric being a looser, thinner weave, I was having issues with my stitches actually pulling out as the fabric was still fraying at the stitch point. And so I ended up doubling up my fabric, and it ended up working out so much better. So even though I have half the wipes now that I have doubled up, I still am actually using the same amount of fabric per diaper change, because previously with the thinner wipes, I was having to use double the amount of wipes. So per diaper change, I was probably using 2 for a dirty diaper instead of just the 1 that I'm now using. So it ends up working out just fine. Luckily, I was still able to salvage the ones that frayed and everything, but I now only had half the amount of wipes that I initially wanted, so luckily I still had plenty of fabric left, so I went ahead and cut a whole new stack of squares. And this time I decided to experiment a little bit and leave my corners as is instead of rounding them, because I realized I was having a little bit of a hard time on my serger getting those corners because it was just too sharp of a turn. Once I have all of my squares paired up and I have them with wrong sides facing each other and right sides out, I take it over to my serger, and I am not messing around this time, and I'm going to be using a rolled edge, also called a rolled hem on some machines. This is the best stitch that I have found for dealing with fabrics that fray a lot, because the thread actually pretty much wraps completely around the raw edge. There is some gapping, but you can adjust it on your machine most of the time to where it has no raw edge of your fabric showing whatsoever. It's completely covered in thread, and this is great for whenever it's going through the wash because it protects that edge and keeps it from fraying. I initially avoided using any of these types of stitches because I thought that with more thread would mean more places for dirt and grime and poop and bacteria in general to kind of fester, but with a proper wash routine, that's really not a problem. I have had 0 issues with that. The thread isn't even stained on any of my wipes after, God, I don't even know how many diaper changes it's been now, 1,000,000. So if that is a concern of yours, don't worry, this is not an issue whatsoever. And as far as dealing with my square corners, as you can see, they're rounded. That's because I'm rounding them off as I sew. So it's the knife for the serger is actually cutting the curve. It's still a little bit patchy around the corners because it is still a tight curve, and the thread is just getting where it can. But you can, once again, you can change the tension on your machine, you can adjust the stitch length and all that, and you can cover that up if it bothers you. At this point, I was so over it. I didn't care what they look like anymore. After all, they are cleaning up poop. So I just stopped caring. It's all about utility at this point. Anyways, this ended up being the winning combination for me, so using the rolled edge along with doubling up my fabric. However, depending on the fabric that you're using, whether it's thinner or thicker, frays a lot or doesn't fray a lot, you might need to use more layers or use a different stitch. So I really urge you to definitely experiment and test before you actually cut into your huge stash of fabric and potentially waste a lot of time and money. I love the way mine turned out. I haven't had any issues so far with mine, and I've been using them for a few months now. Now, currently my baby is exclusively breastfed, and so his poops are water soluble, and so I haven't had any issues with getting them off and getting his butt clean with just water. So I fill up my Perry bottle with water, squirt a little bit on the wipe before I start changing his diaper, and it has been 0 issues whatsoever. I have heard that once the babies start eating solids, or if your baby is formula fed, that you might have a little bit harder of a time. I am anticipating this, and so I bought what's called Diaper Lotion Potion. It has a lot of good reviews on Amazon and online in general, and you mix it with a little bit of water and put it in a squirt bottle, and it's supposed to work great. I can't vouch for it myself, but it does have good reviews, so that's what I'm planning on using. But yeah, I really encourage you guys to give this a try if you are even remotely curious. I think that it's actually not a lot of work, and I do full cloth diapering. It's really not that much extra laundry, and so I'm sure that just using wipes is even less of an issue. I think that this would be even great if you are using disposable wipes and you just want to make sure that you have some backup wipes for just in case you run out or we have another shortage. It's always a good idea just to be prepared in general. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.